The smoke tasted different that morning. Thomas Brennan noticed it first as he stepped outside his half-finished cabin in the Sacramento Valley foothills, late August 1868. Not the clean, sweet smoke of a cook fire or the sharp bite of a blacksmith's forge. This was older, darker, carrying something ancient and hungry on the wind that rolled down from the mountains. The sky hung low and yellow, thick with a haze that made the rising sun look like a copper penny dropped in dirty water. The air itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting, and in that waiting, every man, woman, and child in the settlement of Redwood Flats knew what was coming. Fire season had arrived. Thomas was 31 years old, rail-thin from months of hard travel and harder work, with hands that bore the calluses of a man who'd learned to build from necessity rather than training. He'd come west from Ohio with his wife Mary and their 2 young daughters after a farm failure that still stung when he thought about it. The land here was cheaper, they said. Rich soil, timber everywhere, room to breathe and grow. What they didn't mention in those glossy advertisements back east was how the summers here didn't just get hot. They got apocalyptic. The grasses turned to tinder. The pine needles became carpet bombs waiting for a spark. The very air seemed flammable, so dry it cracked the skin on your lips and made every breath feel like inhaling sand. And when the fires came, and they always came, they didn't creep or crawl. They exploded. They roared. They moved faster than a horse could run, turning 100-foot pines into Roman candles and reducing a man's life work to ash in minutes. Thomas stood in front of the skeletal frame of what was supposed to become his family's home, and he felt the weight of an impossible choice pressing down on his shoulders. Behind him, Mary was washing clothes in a basin outside their tent, the temporary canvas shelter they'd been living in since April. The girls were playing in the dirt nearby, making mud pies with the last water from yesterday's well bucket. They didn't know yet. They were too young to understand what that yellow sky meant, what that particular quality of silence meant. But Mary knew. She'd stopped scrubbing, her hands frozen in the wash water, staring at the mountains. She knew. Every family in Redwood Flats was in the same position. The settlement was barely 3 years old, a collection of about 40 families, scattered across a narrow valley where gold rush dreams had given way to the harder, slower work of farming and logging. Most had arrived within the last 2 years, drawn by railroad promises and land grants. They'd all come with the same plan: build fast, build cheap, get a roof over their heads before winter. Standard frontier construction. Everyone knew the method. You felled the straightest pines you could find, notched them, stacked them, chinked the gaps with mud and moss, split cedar shakes for the roof, and called it home. It was the way cabins had been built since Daniel Boone's day. The formula worked. It had worked in Kentucky, in Tennessee, in Missouri, in every territory where Americans had pushed westward. Logs were plentiful. The technique was proven, and a strong back and a sharp axe could raise a dwelling in a matter of weeks. Thomas had started his cabin the same way. He'd felled 32 pines in June, good thick logs, each one 14 feet long. He'd hauled them to his plot with a borrowed mule, spent a week stripping bark in the brutal sun, and begun the layout for a 16 by 24-foot structure. 2 rooms eventually. A main living space with a hearth on one end, a sleeping room on the other, and if they prospered, maybe a loft for the girls come next summer. The corner notches were clean, the walls were rising straight and true, and several neighbors had stopped by to compliment his work. "Good eye for timber," old Samuel Pritchard had said, running his gnarled hand along one of the logs. "Tight grain. This'll keep you snug come winter." But then Thomas had walked down to see what remained of the Henderson place. The Hendersons had arrived in the valley the previous spring, a full year before Thomas. They'd built the same way. Good logs, proper chinked, solid roof. They'd been proud of it. James Henderson had even carved his initials and the date into the lintel above the door, J.H. 1867. Then, in July, 3 weeks before Thomas arrived in the valley, a lightning strike had started a fire 20 miles to the east. The flames had raced through the high country, jumped 2 creeks that everyone swore were natural fire breaks, and come screaming down the mountainside at a speed that defied belief. The Hendersons had seen it coming. They'd had maybe 20 minutes of warning. They'd grabbed what they could carry, loaded their wagon, and run. They'd made it out alive. That was something. But when they came back 2 days later, after the fire had burned itself out against the river to the west, there was nothing left. The cabin hadn't just burned, it had vanished. The logs they had so carefully selected and shaped had become fuel for an inferno so hot it had melted the iron hinges on the door and left glass from the windows puddled in strange, twisted shapes among the ash. The stone fireplace still stood, blackened and cracked, like a tombstone marking where a home used to be. Thomas had stood in that ash field, and something cold had settled in his stomach. This wasn't Ohio. The rules were different here. The Henderson cabin had been right. It had been built exactly the way a frontier cabin was supposed to be built, and it had burned like a haystack soaked in kerosene. He'd looked around at the dozen other cabins in various stages of construction dotting the valley, including his own, and realized they were all building the same funeral pyre, every single one. They were stacking timber to the sky and calling it shelter. In a place where fire didn't just threaten, it promised, it guaranteed that one day, maybe this year, maybe next, but one day certain, those carefully notched logs would become death traps. That night, Thomas couldn't sleep. He lay in the tent listening to Mary's breathing and the soft sounds of his daughters shifting in their bedrolls, and his mind wouldn't quiet. The problem gnawed at him. He needed a house. Winter in the Sacramento foothills wasn't as brutal as Ohio, but it was wet, cold enough, and living in a tent through February with 2 small children wasn't survivable. But building a log cabin, the only kind of cabin he knew how to build, the only kind anyone here knew how to build, felt like signing his family's death warrant. Maybe the fire wouldn't come this year. Maybe they'd get lucky. Maybe the winter rains would arrive early and soak everything down before fire season got really bad. Maybe, but maybe was a thin thread to hang 4 lives on. The stakes weren't theoretical. The Hendersons weren't the only ones. Thomas had heard the stories from the older settlers, the ones who'd been in California since the early 50s. The fires here weren't like the controlled burns back east, the small brush fires that cleared underbrush and moved on. These were monsters. In 1855, a fire had burned from Sacramento to the Oregon border, consuming an area larger than some eastern states. Men had described walls of flame 200 feet high, moving so fast that deer and elk were found burned to death in mid-stride, unable to outrun it. In 1862, a rancher near Marysville had watched a fire crown through a pine forest, jumping from treetop to treetop like some kind of demonic circus act, never even touching the ground until it ran out of trees to burn. The smoke from that fire had blotted out the sun in San Francisco, 80 miles away, and every year, every single year, the dry season came. The lightning came, or some fool left a campfire unattended, or a spark from a wagon wheel struck the wrong rock, and somewhere the mountains would ignite. The real cruelty was the double bind. The thing that made this valley livable, the thing that had drawn them all here, was the timber. Endless forests of pine and cedar and redwood climbing up every slope, providing lumber for building, fuel for heating, raw material for every aspect of frontier life. But that same timber was also the fuel for the fires. You couldn't have one without the other. The trees that sheltered you also threatened you. And building your home from that timber, surrounding yourself with it, felt increasingly to Thomas like sleeping in a powder magazine with a lit candle. He thought about moving. Maybe they should pack up, cut their losses, head further north, or down into the valley proper where the land was more open. But Mary had already planted a garden. The girls were starting to make friends with other children in the settlement. He'd invested everything they had into the plot of land, registered with the territorial office, secured with a down payment they couldn't afford to lose. And beyond the practical concerns, there was something else, something harder to name. A stubbornness, maybe. A refusal to be beaten by the land, to admit defeat before even really beginning. His grandfather had homesteaded in Ohio when it was still wild territory, had carved a farm from the forest through sheer will and endless labor. Thomas carried that legacy in his bones, that belief that a man who worked hard enough, who thought carefully enough, could solve any problem the land threw at him. Running felt like betrayal, not just of the investment, but of something deeper. So he didn't run. Instead, he started watching, really watching. Not just looking at the valley the way a settler looks at land, assessing timber and water and soil, but watching the way a student watches, trying to understand the language the land itself was speaking. He walked the fire scar where the Henderson place had been, studying not just the destruction, but the patterns within the destruction. Some things had burned completely, vanished into ash. Other things remained. The iron, of course, distorted but present. The stone fireplace. And, oddly, a cast-iron cook stove that had been behind the cabin. The stove was warped, the enamel gone, but the basic structure had survived. Why? Because it was iron, obviously. Fire couldn't consume metal, but that wasn't useful. He couldn't build a house from iron. What else? He noticed that a woodpile the Hendersons had stacked against a boulder 30 yards from the cabin was still there. Charred, yes, blackened, but not consumed. The logs at the bottom, the ones pressed against the rock face, were barely touched. The stone had sheltered them somehow. Pulled heat away, maybe, or simply presented a barrier that the fire couldn't eliminate. Thomas began taking longer walks, sometimes gone for hours, ranging up the mountainside and along the creek beds. He was looking for evidence, for clues. Where did fires stop? What made them stop? Water, obviously. The river was a natural fire break, but what else? He found places where burns had halted at bare rock outcrops, where the fuel simply ran out and the fire died. He found a meadow where wildflowers were growing in a riot of color and realized it was a burn scar from years before. The trees were gone, but in their absence, grass had taken over, and grass didn't burn the same way timber did. It could burn, sure, but it didn't explode into crowning infernos. He followed the creek up into higher country and found where ancient floods had deposited great piles of rounded river stone. The stones were clean, unmarked by fire, even though the forest around them showed char marks from old burns. And then he met old Joseph. Joseph wasn't his real name. Thomas never learned what that was. But everyone called him Old Joseph, and he'd lived in the valley longer than anyone, long before the gold rush, back when this was still Mexican California. He was Maidu from the mountain bands, and he lived alone in a small structure tucked into a fold of the hills, where a spring emerged from the rocks. Thomas had been following the creek and almost walked past without seeing it. The shelter was so unobtrusive, so perfectly integrated into the landscape, that it registered as part of the hillside rather than a human dwelling. When Joseph emerged, Thomas had actually startled, embarrassed to realize he'd wandered onto someone's homestead without noticing. But Joseph didn't seem offended. He was old, face like weathered leather, hair white and long, and he moved with the careful deliberateness of someone whose body hurt, but whose mind was still sharp. He spoke English with a heavy accent, learned from Mexican traders and American settlers, and after a few minutes of awkward introduction, he invited Thomas to sit. They shared water from the spring, cold and clear, and Thomas found himself explaining his problem, the need for shelter, the threat of fire, the seeming impossibility of building something that could withstand both winter and summer, cold and flame. Joseph listened without interrupting, his dark eyes watching Thomas with an intensity that was neither judgmental nor sympathetic, just deeply attentive. When Thomas finished, Joseph was quiet for a long moment. Then he spoke. "Your people build with dead trees standing up. Fire loves dead trees standing up. My people build with earth and stone. Fire cannot eat earth and stone." The words were simple, but they hit Thomas like cold water. Of course that was the answer. But even as the realization dawned, the practical problems flooded in. He didn't know how to build with earth and stone. He'd never seen it done except for stone foundations, and those required skill and time he didn't have. But Joseph seemed to read his thoughts. He stood, beckoning for Thomas to follow, and led him around the hillside to his shelter. Up close, Thomas could see how it was made. The back wall was the hillside itself, the living earth. The sides and front were constructed from a framework of poles, bent and lashed together, then covered with layers of thick sod, earth with the grass roots still holding it together like fabric. The roof was more sod, angled to shed rain, supported by a lattice of smaller branches. The whole structure was maybe 12 feet across, low and unassuming, half buried in the hillside. There was a small opening for a door, covered with a hide flap, and another small hole at the top for smoke. "Fire came 7 winters ago," Joseph said, pointing to the charred trunks of trees on the slopes above his shelter. "Big fire, fast fire. The trees all burned. My house stayed. The earth does not burn." Thomas stared at the structure, his mind racing. It was so unlike anything he'd been taught to build. It wasn't tall or square or impressive. It looked, frankly, primitive, like something from another century, another world. But it had survived. When the trees had become torches, when the Henderson cabin had vaporized, this half-buried dome of earth and grass had endured. The principle was stark in its simplicity. Fire needs fuel, and earth isn't fuel. But could he do this? Could he convince Mary to live in what would look to most people like a hole in the ground? Could he build large enough for a family? And perhaps most daunting, could he face the judgment of his neighbors, who were all building proper cabins, who would see his earth shelter as a failure, a regression, a sign that he couldn't manage real frontier construction? Thomas spent another hour with Joseph, asking questions, examining the construction. The old man was patient, explaining how the poles were flexible green wood, how the sod had to be cut in thick bricks with the roots intact, how the roof angle had to be steep enough to drain water, but not so steep that the sod would slide off. He showed Thomas the small hearth inside, built from river stones and clay, vented through the smoke hole. He explained that the earth walls stayed cool in summer and held warmth in winter, that the structure breathed but didn't leak, that maintenance was constant but manageable. And when Thomas asked about fire, Joseph's answer was definitive. "I do not fear fire anymore. The fire fears my house. It comes, it finds no food, it goes away." Walking back to his plot that evening, Thomas carried both revelation and dread. He knew what he needed to do. The logic was irrefutable, but the social cost loomed large. He'd be the odd one, the crazy one, the man building a hut when everyone else was building cabins. They'd think he was poor or incompetent or worse, that he'd gone native, adopting Indian ways in a settlement that prided itself on bringing civilization to the wilderness. Mary would have to endure the whispers of the other women. His daughters might face teasing from other children. But against that discomfort, he weighed the image of his family trapped in a burning log cabin, the girls screaming, Mary's face frozen in terror, the timber walls that were supposed to protect them becoming a cage of flame. There wasn't really a choice. That night, he told Mary. She listened, sitting very still in the lantern light inside the tent, her face unreadable. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Will it be safe?" Thomas nodded. "Safer than logs." "Much safer." Another pause. "Will it be dry in winter?" He nodded again. Joseph's was dry and cool in summer. The earth insulates. She looked at him, searching his face. People will think we're strange. He met her eyes. People will be alive to think whatever they want. She smiled then, just a small, tired smile. All right, build us an earth house, but make it big enough that I don't feel like I'm living in a root cellar. The next morning, Thomas went into Redwood Flats to the general store to buy a few supplies. Samuel Pritchard was there, along with James Henderson, who'd been rebuilding his cabin on a new plot, and Henry Walsh, who ran the sawmill. They asked Thomas how his cabin was coming along. He hesitated, then decided there was no point in hiding it. "I'm changing the design," he said, "going to build with earth and stone instead of logs." The silence that followed was profound. Then Henry laughed, not unkindly, but with genuine amusement. "Earth and stone? Like a mine shaft? Thomas, you're building a house, not a hole." James Henderson shook his head. "I appreciate unconventional thinking, I do, but you need wood for a proper home. How are you going to frame it? How are you going to get walls that stand straight?" Thomas tried to explain. He talked about fire resistance, about how Joseph's shelter had survived the same blaze that destroyed Henderson's cabin. But the more he talked, the less convinced they looked. Samuel Pritchard, the oldest of the group, finally interrupted. "Son, Indians live in those earth lodges because they don't have the tools or know-how for proper carpentry. We do. You're building down, not up. That's not progress, that's regression." The conversation turned after that, but Thomas caught the looks, the exchanged glances that said, "Poor fellow doesn't know what he's doing." Over the next days, word spread through the settlement. Thomas, the newcomer from Ohio, was building some kind of Indian hut instead of a real cabin. The comments started subtle. "Heard you're going native out there, Thomas. Gonna build a teepee next?" But as his project took shape, the mockery became more pointed. He'd found a spot against a low hillside on his property where a natural fold in the land provided a windbreak and a stable back wall. He started by digging, excavating maybe 4 feet into the hillside to create a level floor below grade. This alone generated comments. People stopped by, ostensibly to see how he was doing, really to gawk at the growing pit in the ground. "Looks like you're preparing a grave, not a home," one helpful neighbor observed. Thomas ignored them, kept digging. Then he began building the framework, setting posts in a wide circle, connecting them with crossbeams, creating a skeleton that would support the roof. The design was larger than Joseph's, ambitious, 20 feet in diameter, with enough interior space for separate sleeping areas and a central living space with a proper hearth. The framework itself was impressive, but to eyes trained on square cabins with perpendicular walls, it looked alien, nonsensical. The real turning point in public opinion came when Thomas started cutting sod. He'd found a meadow with good thick turf, and he spent 3 days cutting bricks of sod, each one about 3 feet long, 18 inches wide, and 4 inches thick, the grass roots holding the earth together in a dense mat. He hauled these back to his site on a sled, stack after stack, and began laying them like massive living bricks against the framework. The technique was labor-intensive, but not complicated. Each layer overlapped the one below, like shingles with the grass side out. As the walls rose, he packed additional earth behind them, creating a thick barrier that was part structure, part landscaping. To most observers, it looked insane. It looked like he was building a compost heap, not a house. The sod was messy, irregular, studded with wildflowers and grass. It didn't look like construction. It looked like he was trying to reassemble a disassembled hillside. One evening, a group of men came by. Thomas recognized them, neighbors, most of whom had been friendly enough before. But now they wore expressions of concern, bordering on intervention. Henry Walsh acted as spokesman. "Thomas, we need to talk. This thing you're building, it's not going to work. Sod won't hold up in the winter rains. It'll turn to mud and collapse. You're wasting time and energy on something that any experienced builder could tell you is doomed to fail. Winter's coming. You've got a family, build a proper cabin, use logs. We'll help you. But this is foolishness." Thomas felt his jaw tighten. "I've seen earth homes survive fires that burned everything else. That's not foolishness. That's smart." Henry shook his head. "You've seen one Indian hut that got lucky. The fire probably went around it, not over it. And even if it did survive, Thomas, we're not Indians. We're Americans. We build with timber. It's what civilized people do." That word, civilized. It hung in the air like a challenge. The implication was clear. Building with earth, adopting native techniques, meant surrendering something essential, something that defined them as different from, better than, the indigenous people they'd displaced. Thomas felt anger flash hot in his chest, but he forced his voice to stay level. "Civilized people survive. Civilized people adapt. If there's a better way to keep my family safe, I'm going to use it, whether it looks traditional or not." The men left shaking their heads, and Thomas overheard one mutter, "Fire trap. That's what it is. Pack all that dry grass and earth, probably catch a spark from his own hearth, and smolder for days before it collapses on top of them. Mark my words." The irony of that phrase, fire trap, was almost too bitter to contemplate. They thought he was building something dangerous because it was unconventional. They couldn't see that their conventional cabins were the actual fire traps, cordwood stacked and waiting for ignition. But Thomas didn't argue further. He just kept working. Mary, to her credit, stood by him. She even started helping, packing mud into gaps, smoothing the interior walls. The girls, too young to understand the controversy, thought the growing structure was a magical cave, delighting in the way their voices echoed inside. As the walls rose higher and the roof began to take shape, covered with layer upon layer of thick sod, the shelter started to feel real, substantial. It didn't look like other houses, but it looked solid. The earth walls were over 2 feet thick in most places, dense and heavy. The interior stayed remarkably cool even on the hottest days, the earth acting as insulation against the brutal sun. By late September, the structure was essentially complete. Thomas had built a proper door frame from scavenged lumber and hung a sturdy plank door. He'd constructed the hearth from river stones, carefully mortared with clay, and cut a proper chimney through the roof, lined with stone to prevent any possibility of the sod catching fire. He'd dug a drainage trench around the perimeter to divert water away from the walls, and he'd reinforced the roof supports with extra beams, creating a structure that felt, when you stood inside it, less like a cave and more like a fortress. The interior was dim but not dark, with 2 small windows on the south side, letting in filtered light. Mary had hung curtains, arranged their few pieces of furniture, and suddenly it was home. Strange, yes. Unconventional, absolutely. But home. Safe. Dry. Cool in the killing heat of late summer. And, Thomas believed, with every fiber of his being, fireproof. The settlement's reaction ranged from amused tolerance to outright derision. The phrase fire trap stuck, used with ironic emphasis by those who thought Thomas had built a disaster waiting to happen. "Going to visit the fire trap," someone would say, heading toward Thomas's place. The children picked it up, chanting it sometimes when Thomas's daughters played in the settlement square. It stung, but Thomas endured it. He had no way to prove his shelter's worth except through the very disaster he was trying to prevent, and he certainly wasn't wishing for that. So he worked his land, cut timber for sale to the sawmill, helped neighbors with their own projects when asked, and tried to blend in as much as a man living in a grass-covered dome could blend in among log cabins. October came, and with it the first real rains. The skeptics watched Thomas's shelter carefully, waiting for the walls to dissolve or the roof to collapse. It didn't. The sod held, the grass roots binding the earth together, the thick mass shedding water rather than absorbing it. Inside, the shelter stayed dry and surprisingly warm, the earth walls holding the heat from the hearth long into the night. November brought harder rains, and still the shelter stood. December was cold, though nothing like Ohio winters, and Thomas's family slept comfortably while other settlers shivered in cabins where wind whistled through gaps in the chinking. By January, the mockery had quieted somewhat. The shelter was weird, yes, but it was also undeniably functional. It hadn't failed in any of the ways predicted. But it also hadn't been tested by fire. That was coming. The winter rains ended in early March. By April, the land was drying out, the grasses turning from green to gold, the forests shedding their winter moisture. May brought heat, real heat. And by June, the valley was back in the grip of the same brutal dryness that defined every summer. The yellow haze returned, the wind picked up, hot and desiccating. Fire season had returned. The settlement watched the mountains nervously. Lightning strikes in the high country were visible at night, brief flashes that could mean nothing or could mean everything. In mid-July, a small fire broke out 5 miles to the south. It burned for 2 days before rain, miraculous late-season rain, extinguished it. The settlement breathed easier. Maybe this year would be lucky. Maybe the rains would come back early. Maybe the fires would stay small and distant. Then came August. The heat that August was unlike anything even the old-timers remembered. Day after day above 100 degrees, the nights barely cooling below 80. The creeks were low, some drying up completely. The forest floor crunched underfoot, every needle and leaf and twig tinder dry. The air had that quality again, that waiting quality, where every breath seemed to carry the promise of combustion. And on August 23, 1869, 1 year and almost exactly 1 month after Thomas had first arrived in Redwood Flats, the lightning came. A freak summer storm, moisture from the south colliding with hot air over the mountains, creating conditions for lightning without rain. The settlers watched from their doorways as the sky flickered and boomed, dry lightning, the worst kind. Somewhere up in the high country, maybe 10 miles to the northeast, a bolt found a dead pine snag, superheated by months of sun. The tree exploded into flame like a match struck against stone. Within minutes, the fire had spread to surrounding trees. Within an hour, it had crowned, jumping from treetop to treetop, creating its own wind, a roaring firestorm that began racing down the mountain toward the valley. The first warning came from a hunter who'd been in the high country checking trap lines. He came riding into Redwood Flats at full gallop, horse-lathered and wild-eyed, shouting one word: fire! People poured out of their cabins looking northeast and saw it, a wall of smoke, impossibly tall, boiling up into the sky, turning the sun blood red, and at the base of that smoke, visible even at distance, an orange glow that pulsed and flickered like the breath of some enormous beast. The settlement exploded into organized chaos. Men began dragging valuables out of cabins, loading wagons. Women gathered children, bundled supplies. The plan, such as it was simple: get to the river. The river was 2 miles west, the natural fire break. If they could get across, they'd be safe. But there were 40 families, maybe 150 people, and not nearly enough wagons. And the fire was moving faster than seemed possible. What had been 10 miles away at dawn was maybe 7 miles by noon, and it was accelerating. Thomas stood outside his shelter, watching the smoke, calculating angles and wind speed. Mary was beside him, the girls clinging to her skirts, faces pale with fear. "We need to go," Mary said, her voice tight. "Load the wagon. We need to go now." But Thomas was thinking. The river was 2 miles. The fire was moving at maybe 3 or 4 miles an hour through the forest, maybe faster in the wind. If they loaded the wagon, joined the exodus, they'd make it. Probably. Unless the fire moved faster than expected. Unless the road clogged with panicked settlers and their livestock. Unless. He looked at his shelter, half buried in the hillside, surrounded by a clearing he'd maintained. Grass trimmed short, no brush piled against the walls. He'd built defensible space without even knowing that's what he was doing, an instinct borrowed from watching how fires stopped at bare ground. And the shelter itself, 2 feet of earth, No wood except the internal framework, buried under layers of sod and stone. He made a decision that seemed insane, even as he made it. "We're staying," he said. Mary stared at him. "What?" "Thomas, no, the fire is coming. We have to run." But Thomas shook his head. "Listen to me. That river is going to be chaos. 150 people trying to cross at the same ford with wagons and animals. If the fire gets there before everyone crosses, people will die. We built this shelter to survive fire. I believe it will. And this is its test." Mary's face was a war between trust and terror. "You're sure?" Thomas looked her in the eyes. "I'm sure. The fire can't burn earth, and we have water." They had 3 barrels of well water, more than most, and the well itself was still producing. If the fire comes, if it gets close, we get inside. We seal the door, we wait it out. The earth will protect us. Mary took a shaky breath, then nodded. "All right, we stay. But if you're wrong, Thomas Brennan, I'm going to kill you in the afterlife." They didn't have time to tell anyone. The settlement was in full evacuation mode, a river of people and possessions flowing toward the road that led to the river crossing. Thomas saw Henry Walsh and his family race past in their wagon, saw the Hendersons with all their worldly goods piled precariously high, saw Samuel Pritchard helping his elderly wife onto a horse. No one looked at Thomas's place. In the panic, his earth shelter, tucked against its hillside, barely registered. They were all focused on one thing, getting away. Within 2 hours, the settlement was empty. 40 cabins stood silent, doors hanging open where people had fled too quickly to close them. And Thomas's family stood alone beside their strange, buried home, watching the fire come. The smoke arrived first, thick and choking, turning day into twilight. Then the wind picked up hot and fierce, carrying embers that danced and swirled like demonic fireflies. Thomas could hear the fire now, a roar like a continuous thunderclap, punctuated by explosive cracks as trees burst from the heat. The glow on the horizon was no longer distant. It was close, terrifyingly close, a moving wall of orange and red that consumed the forest as it advanced. Birds fled overhead in panicked flocks. A deer burst from the trees at the valley's edge, running flat out, crashing through the empty settlement and disappearing toward the river. The heat was building, the air itself seeming to shimmer and warp. Thomas began soaking blankets in water, draping them over the shelter's sod roof. He filled every container they had with well water, hauled bucket after bucket. Mary took the girls inside, and Thomas followed, pulling the heavy door shut behind him, sealing them in. The interior was dark except for the small amount of light filtering through the chimney hole. They huddled together on the earthen floor, listening. The sound, when the fire reached the settlement, was apocalyptic. A roaring that seemed to come from everywhere at once, punctuated by explosions as cabins ignited. Through the chimney, Thomas could see the sky itself burning, flames visible through the opening, so bright it hurt to look. The heat was intense, even through the earth walls, but not unbearable. Not yet. He'd plugged the chimney with wet sod, creating a seal, trading smoke ventilation for protection. The air inside grew thick and hot but breathable. The girls were crying, Mary was praying, and Thomas sat with his back against the earth wall, feeling the heat radiating through the soil, willing the shelter to hold. Outside, the world was ending. Inside, they waited in the dark, entombed in the earth that Thomas had gambled everything would save them. The fire passed directly over them. Thomas felt it, felt the shelter shudder as superheated wind hit the roof, felt the earth walls grow hot to the touch. But they didn't ignite. They couldn't ignite. Fire needs fuel, and packed earth 2 feet thick offers nothing to burn. The sod on the roof, green and moist from Thomas's last-minute soaking, steamed but didn't catch. The door, heavy plank behind 2 feet of earthen wall, held. The chimney, plugged and protected, didn't become a flue-drawing fire inside, For what felt like hours but was probably only 30 or 40 minutes, the fire raged overhead and around them, consuming everything combustible in a frenzy of heat and hunger. And then, gradually, the roar began to diminish. The explosions became less frequent. The light through the chimney hole faded from searing white-orange to red to sullen amber. The fire was passing, moving on toward the river, leaving devastation in its wake. Thomas waited another hour before he dared open the door. When he finally did, smoke and heat poured in, but the flames were gone. He stepped outside into an alien landscape. The settlement was gone, simply gone. Where 40 log cabins had stood, there were now only stone chimneys and rubble. The Henderson cabin, rebuilt so carefully after the first fire, had burned again, reduced to ash and scattered debris. Henry Walsh's sawmill was a skeleton of twisted metal and charred beams. Samuel Pritchard's fine 2-story home, the pride of the settlement, had collapsed into a glowing pile of embers. Every single wooden structure had been consumed. The trees surrounding the settlement were blackened spires, dead and skeletal. The ground itself was ash, still hot, smoke rising from patches where roots smoldered underground. And in the middle of this apocalyptic wasteland stood Thomas's shelter, scarred but standing. The sod on the roof was blackened, the grass burned away, but the earth beneath was intact. The walls were smoke-stained but solid, the door was scorched but functional. They had survived. Mary emerged with the girls, and they stood together in stunned silence, looking at the destruction. Then, in the distance, they heard voices. The survivors from the river crossing were returning, coming to see what remained of their homes. The first to arrive was Henry Walsh, riding ahead of his family. He saw the devastation, saw the chimneys standing like gravestones, saw his sawmill destroyed. Then his eyes found Thomas's shelter. He rode closer, staring, his face cycling through disbelief, shock, and something that might have been the first glimmering of understanding. When he reached Thomas, he dismounted without speaking, walked around the shelter, touched the earth walls, ran his hand along the scorched but unbroken sod. Finally he looked at Thomas. "It survived," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Your fire trap survived." More people arrived, families returning to find everything they'd built destroyed, returning to face the reality that they would be starting over from nothing. But there was one home standing, the strange earth lodge that everyone had mocked, the primitive structure that had been the butt of jokes and derision, the shelter they'd called a fire trap with such confident scorn. It stood, blackened, scarred by the flames, but standing, whole, safe. The word spread through the gathering crowd. Thomas's place survived. The earth house made it through. People approached cautiously, examining the shelter with new eyes. Samuel Pritchard, who'd lost everything, shook Thomas's hand with tears in his eyes. "You were right," he said simply. "You were right, and we were fools." James Henderson, surveying the ash field where his cabin had been for the second time in as many years, asked the question that was on everyone's mind. How did it survive? Thomas explained, and this time people listened. He explained about Earth not being fuel, about mass and insulation, about learning from the land itself and from those who'd lived here long before. He explained about observation and adaptation, about questioning assumptions and being willing to look foolish if it meant finding a better way. He explained that old Joseph's people had known these things for generations, had developed techniques refined over centuries to cope with a landscape that demanded respect and intelligence, not just brute force and tradition. And he explained that survival, real survival, meant being humble enough to learn from anyone who had knowledge to share, regardless of whether they fit your definition of civilized. The days that followed were strange ones. The settlement had to rebuild, but the conversation about how to rebuild was completely different now. Thomas's shelter became a learning laboratory. Families came to examine the construction, to understand the principles, Old Joseph, invited into the settlement for the first time anyone could remember, came to share his knowledge. He taught them about earthwork construction, about using what the land provided rather than forcing the land to accommodate imported ideas. Not everyone wanted to build earth lodges, some still clung to the familiarity of timber construction, but even those who rebuilt with logs did so differently. They cleared defensible space around their cabins. They used stone and earth for fire breaks. They incorporated earth insulation where possible. They stopped building dense wooden structures and started thinking about how to survive the next fire, because there would always be a next fire. Thomas's family became something of a curiosity, but the nature of the attention shifted. Where before they'd been viewed with pity or derision, now people approached with respect and questions. How thick should the walls be? What kind of soil works best? How do you maintain the roof? Can you build larger structures using these principles? Thomas answered everything he could, and when he didn't know, he brought old Joseph to answer. The two men formed an unlikely partnership, the Ohio settler and the Maidu elder, teaching a new generation of frontier inhabitants that survival wasn't about replicating what you'd always done. It was about observing what worked and having the courage to adopt it, even when it looked wrong to eyes trained on different landscapes. The shelter itself required surprisingly little repair. Thomas replaced the burned grass on the roof with fresh sod, patched a few spots where the heat had caused some minor cracking in the earthen walls, and within a week it was as functional as ever. More functional even, because now the settlement understood its value. The fire had been the test that Thomas never wanted, but always knew would come. And the shelter had passed. Not perfectly, nothing made by human hands is perfect, but well enough. Well enough to keep his family safe while everything around them burned. That was the only standard that mattered. The phrase fire trap fell out of use, replaced with a grudging admiration. Some of the settlers even started calling it the fortress, a name Thomas found equally strange, but didn't discourage. Names didn't matter. Safety mattered. As fall arrived and the rains began again, turning the black ash fields into meadows of sprouting grass and wildflowers, Thomas sometimes stood outside his shelter and thought about the journey that had brought him here. The farm failure in Ohio that had seemed like the end of the world at the time. The risky decision to come west with a young family. The terrifying realization that the tried-and-true methods of frontier building would get them killed. The loneliness of being the odd one, the laughingstock building a grass hut while everyone else built proper homes. The vindication when the fire came and revealed the truth that earth doesn't burn. But more than the vindication, he thought about the larger lesson, the thing that went beyond construction technique or survival strategy. The willingness to question, the humility to learn, the courage to be wrong in the eyes of others if it meant being right in the eyes of reality. His grandfather had carved a farm from Ohio wilderness, using the methods of his day, and that was admirable. But his grandfather had never had to face wildfire on this scale. He'd never had to adapt to a landscape fundamentally different from the eastern forests he knew. Thomas had been forced to adapt or perish, and in adapting, he'd discovered something his grandfather never needed to learn. That wisdom isn't about preserving tradition for tradition's sake. It's about extracting principle from practice and applying that principle to new circumstances. The principle wasn't build with logs. The principle was build with what protects you from your environment's specific threats. In Ohio, that meant logs for insulation against cold. In California, it meant earth for protection from fire. Same principle, different application. Over the following years, as Redwood Flats rebuilt and matured, Thomas's shelter became a landmark and a teaching tool. Other settlements dealing with fire threat sent representatives to see it. People wrote letters describing it to family back east. A newspaper in Sacramento even sent a reporter to write a story about the man who built an Indian hut and survived the Great Fire of 1869. The article was somewhat sensationalized, but it captured the essential truth. Innovation often looks like foolishness until it proves itself. And sometimes the old ways, the ways that modern people dismiss as primitive, contain hard-won knowledge that modernity ignores at its peril. Thomas never claimed to have invented anything. He always gave credit to old Joseph and the Maidu people whose techniques had saved his family. He became an advocate for cross-cultural learning, for the idea that settlers and indigenous people had things to teach each other if they could get past the arrogance that made one group assume they had nothing to learn. The settlement, for its part, never forgot the lesson of the fire. As new families arrived, they were told the story of Thomas's shelter, shown the surviving structure, educated about fire safety and defensible space, and the importance of building with the land rather than against it. The culture of the settlement shifted, slowly but definitely, from one that prized conventional appearance to one that valued practical functionality. It became a point of pride that Redwood Flats was different, that they'd learned from disaster and adapted. When the next big fire came through 6 years later, the settlement was ready. Not everyone had built earth shelters, but everyone had fire breaks, defensible space, and emergency plans. Losses were minimal. People survived. The land taught. And they'd finally learned to listen. Thomas's daughters grew up in that earth shelter, never thinking it was strange because it was home to them. They told stories to their own children about the fire, about the day their father's crazy idea saved their lives. Old Joseph lived another decade, spending his final years as a respected elder in a settlement that had learned to value his knowledge. When he died, Thomas and Mary attended his funeral, one of only 2 white families who did. And Thomas spoke about what Joseph had taught him, not just about building, but about seeing, really seeing, what the land was trying to tell you. Henry Walsh rebuilt his sawmill and became one of Thomas's closest friends, the kind of friendship forged when someone admits they were wrong and you prove you were right, without rubbing it in. They worked together on multiple projects over the years, combining timber expertise with earth construction, creating hybrid structures that were both beautiful and functional, and the shelter itself stood for another 40 years, outlasting most of the timber structures built in the same period. It required maintenance, periodic patching, and resodding, but it endured. When Thomas and Mary finally retired and moved to live with their daughter in Sacramento, they sold the property to a young couple who'd heard the story and specifically wanted to live in the famous earth shelter. The structure served as a home for 3 more generations before finally being replaced in the early 1900s, not because it failed, but because modern building codes and materials made it obsolete. But even then, when it was decommissioned, architects and historians came to document it, to measure it, to understand it. Some of its techniques found their way into modern earthen construction methods, into the sustainable building movement of later eras. The specific structure faded, but the principle endured. Build with respect for your environment's specific challenges, and don't let tradition blind you to better solutions. The story of Thomas Brennan's shelter became a legend in California fire country, told and retold, embellished and simplified over the years. Some versions made Thomas out to be a genius ahead of his time. Others focused on the mockery he endured. Still others emphasized the drama of the fire itself. But the core truth remained constant in every telling. When the fire came, when the traditional structures burned and the conventional wisdom failed, it was the strange earth lodge, the one everyone called a fire trap, that saved lives. It was the humble willingness to learn from those who knew the land better, to adapt rather than insist, that made the difference between survival and catastrophe. And that lesson, more than any specific construction technique, was what mattered. That lesson was what Thomas hoped would endure long after the physical shelter had crumbled back into the hillside from which it came, because the real fire trap wasn't the Earth Lodge. It never was. The real fire trap was the stubborn certainty that the way things had always been done was the way things must be done. The real fire trap was the arrogance that assumed imported knowledge was superior to local wisdom. The real fire trap was the pride that made men mock what they didn't understand and cling to methods that would kill them. Thomas had escaped that trap, not through brilliance, but through observation, humility, and the willingness to be thought a fool by those who would later thank him for being wise. He'd watched the land, he'd listened to those who knew it, and he'd built accordingly. That was the whole secret. That was the lost knowledge that every generation has to relearn. Nature doesn't care about your traditions, only about whether you respect her rules. And the first rule in fire country was clear as the smoke-filled sky. Don't build with fuel, build with earth. The land had been trying to teach that lesson since long before any settler arrived. Thomas just happened to be one of the few humble enough to listen. The settlement of Redwood Flats exists today as a small California town, and the story of Thomas Brennan's shelter is still told, still taught in local schools, still remembered when fire season returns and the sky turns that particular shade of yellow that makes old-timers nervous. The exact location of the original shelter has been lost to time and development, but there's a historical marker near where it's believed to have stood, and every few years, when a particularly bad fire threatens the area, someone will write a newspaper article or a blog post reminding people of the day when one man's fire trap was the only structure to survive. And in that remembering, in that retelling, the deeper truth survives too. That wisdom isn't found only in books or traditions or the opinions of the majority. Sometimes it's found in the dirt beneath your feet, in the techniques of people whose names history forgot, in the courage to build different when different means survival. That truth burned itself into the memory of Redwood Flats on August 23, 1869, and no subsequent fire, no matter how fierce, has ever fully erased it.